internal. It was customary to get up early and go for a walk along the cobblestone streets. The fresh air was thick with the scent of dew, wet earth, and damp straw. At the end of the street, the hill began. From its heights, you could see the roofs of the small houses that made up the town. Reddish, corrugated roofs surrounding the cobblestone streets. Karenitis made the journey every day. Upon reaching the mountain, he would sit on a rock and stare into space, thinking. Something very strange had happened to him the day before. After spending the entire night heating the mixture and adding the necessary substances for the transmutation, he had realized that the goal was not to transform the substance into gold. He remembered the look on Pornius's face, his assistant. The eyes were wide open, expectant, focusing on him. Charentus had noticed that Pornius was looking at him, and that this vision must be very different from the vision he had of himself when his image was reflected in the mirror. It was obvious. Turning the mixture into gold was just a game compared to being able to become his assistant, and thus see himself. It must be magnificent to have Pornius's vision with Charentus's experience. He would learn more about himself, much more than by dedicating himself to making gold. Charentus stood up from the rock and breathed in the mountain air, feeling alive, and as if he had just woken from a long sleep. The problem wasn't easy to solve. He couldn't heat or cool himself, like the mixture, to wait for the transformation, nor could acid be added or evaporated. The method had to be different. Karenitis was very patient, as every alchemist must learn to be, otherwise nothing would be achieved. Therefore, he wasn't frightened by the prospect of having to wait a long time before finding the solution. First, it occurred to him that to see himself through Pornius's eyes, he would have to know Pornius well. For 2 years, the assistant endured the most thorough interrogation on record, but to no avail. Later, Karenitis had an idea. He would sit in front of his metal mirror and try to see his own eyes. This would surely bring the moment closer. Pornius couldn't understand how someone could spend so much time in front of a mirror. He began to doubt his master's health, and like the rest of the village, to think that Karenius was going mad. After a year of staring in front of the mirror, all Karenius got was a splitting headache, so he abandoned that method. One night, Karenius had a dream. He saw Paracelsus arriving at his laboratory with a large flask in his hands. Karenius knew that Paracelsus was the greatest alchemist of all time, so he dared to ask him the meaning of the flask. Paracelsus looked him in the eye, and with a delicate movement, dropped the flask on the floor, shattering it. Karenius woke up sweating. Every action of Paracelsus had a profound meaning. Having destroyed the flask, even if it was a dream, was a lesson he must try to understand. For 10 days, Karenius lived on the mountain meditating in his sleep. He thought that by destroying the flask, Paracelsus had meant to tell him that although alchemy was only a path, he must follow it completely before reaching his destination. That once he had done so, he could destroy the tool, but not before. It was very obvious. Interrogating Pornius or looking in the mirror would achieve nothing. He had to return to his work. The fire had been burning for 7 years, and nothing had happened. Karenius was reaching such a level of despair that he felt he was about to explode. He had searched for 10 years, and absolutely nothing had happened. He had found no gold, nor had he transformed himself. Karenius took an axe and began destroying his life's work. When he finished, he headed for the mountain, determined to live as a hermit. The cave was cool, the entrance surrounded by vines, and a large rock partially blocked it. Karenius had found it after walking through the forest for 2 days and 2 nights. He cut branches and leaves from the neighboring trees and placed them at the bottom. That would be his bed. He found a birch log, and with his own hands, removed the head, carried it to the cave, and with great difficulty placed it in the center. That would be his table, and it would remind him that the center is the essence. At least that's what he had learned as an alchemist. The nights were placid, the only sounds being the murmur of the stream and the chirping of crickets. At 6 in the morning a ray of orange light entered, seeming to move along the cave floor, and the moment it touched Kyrenius's face, it would wake him up. There was no metal mirror, no flasks, no fires, no Pornius. Kyrenius spent the morning hunting. When the sun struck 12, and the earth became too hot, he returned to the cave with his prey and prepared a lunch. In the afternoons he sat by the stream and threw pebbles, watching the ripples that formed and crashed against each other. In Teneb, the absence of Kyrenius was discussed. Some said he had evaporated during one of his experiments. Others thought he had thrown himself into an abyss in his madness. Only Pornius knew that his master had gone in search of his image. The storm was furious. Kyrenius had never seen anything like it. The thunder shook the inside of the cave, and the lightning seemed to set his entire body on fire. He saw his hands covered in scars and marks caused by fire, acids, and aqua regia. The storm painted them an electric violet. He touched his face despite the cold. He was sweating. His hands began to tremble. Kyrenius felt his stomach clench. He had heard others say that fear made the stomach sweat, tremble, and contract. He thought for a moment and realized that for the first time in his life he felt fear. It's an unpleasant sensation, he thought. It's inside me like a leech clinging to my stomach. I can't believe it was caused by the storm. It's just a natural phenomenon. Kyrenius trembled. He lay down on his bed of leaves and tried to sleep, but he couldn't. It was too intense, too much light, too much noise, too cold. He remembered Paracelsus and thought he saw the flask fall and shatter as it hit the ground. He felt fear and began to shout with joy. Anyone who had seen that human figure emerge from the cave in the middle of a storm and begin to dance and thank the thunder would have thought it was a ghost, a madman, or a wild beast in human form. Kyrenius was grateful for the rain. He had never felt such joy. His desire to see himself through Pornius's eyes had vanished. All that remained was the feeling of having experienced fear and of having understood. Prologue. To achieve total fluidity, it is necessary to change. So many changes until the most inclusive reference point manifests itself at will. When such a liberation occurs, even the reference point can be transformed, and a colossal leap is made. One learns to decide. The changes then begin to be universe-wide. Consciousnesses are recognized, and each one transforms. This is the level of creating new consciousness. And to be able to see the above, strength is needed. Therefore, when reference points become universes and then consciousnesses, it is necessary to regain confidence to continue living from unity. That's why I came to San Jose. Consciousness must be accompanied by self-awareness. To the latter, the conviction that the process is infinite and has no limits. Nothing helps us recognize the past more than resolving outstanding issues. What is called from the past must be transformed into the present or sublimated. That is why there are thinkers and philosophers. Returning to what was taken up, or returning to what was mixed up, pardon the good humor, they say that the issue of being is resolved if its non-existence is accepted. They claim that each experience is a distinct being and that there is no unifying entity. Others argue that the only condition for this not to occur is that the different beings recognize each other. If the latter is correct, true identity is not being but consciousness. Still others conclude that it is neither being nor consciousness but action. Those of us who are trying to learn to transform the return to the reference point into a voluntary one know that it unifies everything that came before. Because what is decided is the being, the consciousness, the act, or any other consciousness of consciousness. We are working on that, but we will stop doing so in a moment. I needed to confess it 4 and 3 years after writing the messages during the awakening of consciousness, to avoid misunderstandings. The awakening of consciousness is the encounter with oneself from silence, that is, being in the world from which one is what one is without name, verb, or explanation. It then happens that a voice speaks and tells you what must be done. Surrender to it is faith for the Christian, devotion for the Hindu, grace for the mystic, and enlightenment for those versed in winds and the energy fields of ants. When all of life is devoted to what is, nameless as Maharishi would say, to intuition for Taylor or any other American, or to sanity, to recall Guevara Rojas here, what is becomes infinite and simultaneously all-present. Memories are cycles of life. Each memory is a world in itself. That's why old people love to remember. That's why children have no memory. I tell myself that I shouldn't jump around, and I feel and know that there is something that encompasses me. I look around and suddenly find myself inside a translucent capsule that reflects my own reflection, that shows me the creation of my experience and perception. It's very simple to say, but it raises the deepest questions. Who is the observer? Does an observer really exist? What is observed? Who is behind the words? The recovery of being is total attention. It involves a detailed recognition of every element of thought. For this reason, Wundt deserved the title of master when he created the introspectionist school, at the very least for having taught 1 or 2 consciences to follow step by step the development of the affairs of consciousness. However, introspection certainly has a limit that must be transcended. This is the expansion of the self. I mean, when you listen to a voice that no longer belongs to your internal process and accept it as a guide. For some spirits, the above is sufficient. Others will dialogue with their consciousness. Mountains will speak to them. Clouds, rivers, waterfalls will answer them. He will see them as friends. He will do his will only when both are convinced of it. And soon, both will be seen, and thus will reflect on their own limits and once again transcend them. For those who engage in dialogue with the world, for those who know themselves to be more than just creators of experiences and experiences, for them I write. There are many consciousnesses awakening as I write this. My own learns to dialogue with the wind from here in the Sierra de Oaxaca. We recognize each other as friends, and every time I think about the wind it responds. I even ask it to send messages, and it does. He finally teaches me to trust him, and I thank him for the life he gives me. I awaken to the reality of the wind as a being in itself. I recognize its truth, and laugh at having forgotten its presence. City life, I think, is responsible for the lack of wind. Here, in the middle of the mountains, the wind blows and answers questions. He's my friend. They say the beginning of spring is the beginning of a new life. Sometimes childbirth hurts. New beings are thus created, and they communicate with each other. The wind has become so excited that it blows through every corner, and I have to stop writing to put on a jacket. This is what happens at the beginning of any emotional relationship. There's a lot of passion. I don't mean it should be suppressed, but rather kept self-sufficient. Also, its overflow like this wind causes colds. He answers that he is not afraid of jokes. I feel death on my left and end the absurd dialogue. I say goodbye to the wind, and it to me, friendly, respectful but different. I begin to hear the man. I'm 5 minutes from town, and he calls out to me. I reject the call. Now the wind can continue answering. I tell you, I'll say that today I learned to talk to the wind. That's what I'll tell the man today. I hope it helps the man of today. For now, I want to keep talking to the wind. I tell it I can't stand men. It responds with caresses and I thank it, my heart beating like that of a new lover. The wind and I lovers. Now the sun is approaching. It has been trying to warm the place where I meditate for 8 hours, and it's about to do so. Now I have 2 friends. The sun warms me, and I talk to the wind. The sun and I move slowly, but we shine more than the wind. Now something calls me to my left, and I feel someone mocking me. I recognize death as my advisor, and so I abandon the mockery, leaving it behind in disgust. I return with the sun and the wind. I cannot stand man. Ah! The wind tells me, you who had convinced me of your species, now you despise it. A cloud is about to obscure the sun. It took 8 hours to reach my shadow, and now a cloud wants to cover it. So I'll have to learn to talk to the clouds. I've done it before, but I've forgotten. And besides, I'm alone. Before it was with Andrea. The friendly wind helped me clear the cloud. They're good advisors. Now I had a bad thought, and the cloud covered the sun. The cloud tells me that it will always be with her. The clouds, Andrea, and I have a long history. Convincing the clouds to be part of my life is a difficult task. It requires continuing the story alone. That's what I do, and I find them spiteful. They take revenge with lightning. They are loving when they caress with their rain. They know how to create lives. I respect them. I think I can handle the sun and the wind, but the clouds. They are primitive, colossal, majestic beings, but they can already be seen. Sometimes they join together and cover large portions of the planet. In others, they wander innocent and isolated, lost in an intense blue, searching for some thunder. The wind proves me right. In truth, when I was going to write all this, I was thinking of doing a theoretical analysis of my work, and here I am more emotional than ever. I was going to start by talking about the conditions for the awakening of a consciousness. I was going to say that in April 1978, they said we would be in a crisis, and that now more than ever it is necessary to know: 1. That we create experience. 2. That our true identity is the whole. Conclusions from the most serious of psychophysiologies. Our learning and our multiple awakenings direct us toward the whole, through steps of increasing inclusion. Our organic body includes the energy fields we create, and the space with which they interact. The wind has become frantic. A fierce cloud is approaching. Now it greets me. A dragon! I think I should continue my learning with clouds. It seems to me that everything is clouding over. Does that mean that clouds respond to calls, like the sun and the wind? The clouds have covered the sun and are preparing for the storm. I appreciate you taking the time to come with waterproof clothing, and I understand the clouds are to blame for the man's confinement. The sun shines on me again, and my friendly wind keeps my light without shadows. I try again to have a peaceful dialogue with the clouds. Another dragon approaches me and doesn't respond when I ask him about his intentions. I feel I must meditate to see when I open my eyes again who I've spoken to. But I'm not interested in discussing meditation for now. Everything becomes clouded, again, by my refusal to discuss the matter of meditation. I've already experienced several points of reference today: unity with nature, dialogue with its beings, theoretical analysis, intuition, poetic feeling. The only thing left for me to do is to show the being. When I was about to say that, I thought that the only reality is man, through his creative capacity. It's possible, I told myself, but for now, he's wounded. So I'll continue with the clouds. I was going to ask someone living here, Don Enadino in particular, if he talks to the clouds and how he does it. But I held back. There were several beings with no intentions. It seems to me that the clouds have finally become my friends. I happened to convince one of them of my lack of inconsistencies, and she believed me, warning everyone of my honesty and publicly announcing my innocence. I know this because every time I write something silly, a cloud hides the sun, and every time I'm not lying, It moves away from the light and illuminates my hand. But it's she. The sun and the wind are brothers, but she. And here I draw on my melodramatic spirit to say that I don't know the feminine conscience as I should. My bitter experiences on earth have made me suspect that behind feminine benevolence lies hatred, that her decisions are whims, etc., etc. But let's leave my deaths aside and continue. I see rain in the distance. I understand the clouds and their emotions a little better. The thank you is immediate. A cold, damp wind responds to my acknowledgement. They'll ask, "Why am I grateful?" and not responding, and I'll tell them that, for the same decision as before, I still don't understand the feminine spirit decision. So this is where the whole always postponed chapter about decisions comes in. I thought I saw a cloud suddenly move away from the sun. What I know is that everything lit up brightly and the heat was felt. A life is decided upon that has within it the greatest possible number of decisions, so that the last one is to abandon all the others. The decision is made to no longer decide. Other times, you learn to decide not to decide in the usual way, with gestures, shouting, psychosomatic illnesses and cancer. I am referring, rather, to the decision not to decide to decide. Too abstract for the wind, which at the height of its excitement opened a circular hole in the clouds above my head, so the sun also greeted me resoundingly, burning my leg. To tell the truth, it's also too abstract for me. I'm distracted for a moment by the sound of an engine, and I realize I've been weak. By deciding not to decide, I mean two things. On the one hand, the infinite capacity of the levels of consciousness to include previous levels within more powerful integrations. The annoying clouds blocked out the sun on this first day of spring. I felt so bad that I decided, once again, to meditate. I realized I was transforming into a machine, asking its master for permission to check its programs and parts. I knew such a thought was from the devil, and then I felt my body tearing apart. I learned that all the cells in my body are intertwined and connected to an energetic field that holds them in place through materialized processes. Little by little, I join in and feel the greeting of the sun, the love of the wind, and the caresses of the clouds. Finally, it seems the sun, the wind, and now the clouds have accepted me. I'm very grateful and prepared to enter my body. I decided to know what meditation for God is. I begin to meditate, but I can't continue. Apparently, they won't let me. Now I remember that every time I've tried, the sun has abandoned me and a truck has driven by, making an unbearable noise. I guess I shouldn't be impatient. I should wait and be. Sunset. Clouds have taken over the entire sky. There's no wind or sun, only calm. The earth sleeps, and from this place on the mountain I see the earth, the sky, the mountain, and the landscape with new eyes. The pine-covered mountains are hidden behind veils that make them whitish until far away the last one merges with the sky, the sun and the clouds. Everything rests in this mountain sunset, and everything dreams of being bigger, healthier, stronger, more united with itself. Clouds, dear mothers, protect and calm. They nourish us with life and give themselves to those who love them most. The planet is their lover, and in it they rest. From it they come and are nourished and rest and flourish and rise and return to bathe him with their tears. If I could describe you, O Earth, if I could transform your dialogues and dealings into words, if I could define what you teach. The end is being, but it is necessary to reach the end. The crickets can be heard plunging waterfalls of sounds into the mouth of time. Some dogs at the edge of the landscape barked when there was a fight, but now they are silent. The village music sings for the peace of the moment. The wind murmurs a greeting, and a goose is startled by its forgetfulness. But something is missing for all this to transform into the body of my beloved. I'm missing some eyes that see all this with me, a mouth that speaks to me, and suddenly I know that there are eyes and the mouth has spoken, and I no longer feel alone. March 21, 1978, San Jose del Pacifico, Oaxaca. Recognizing limits is the best way to avoid losing your mind. Unfortunately. According to Don Lucio, there are no limits, and here, there and beyond are the same. I would agree if St. Joseph of the Pacific would let me meditate. I just experienced the first part of the prologue to the awakening of my consciousness. It was 9 hours of dialogue with time. I'd say it's an excellent start to Don Lucio's teachings. Now the wind, the sun and the clouds are my friends. I know myself better. I was about to find out what he knew about me, and I was scared. But it was enough to make me realize the process involved inclusion. Inclusion again. Everything told me I had to view everything from an already expanded consciousness. It had been a while since I'd realized such things, and I happily prepared to enter the change. I'm no longer afraid, I told myself. The dialogue had worked. However, the more expanded consciousness does not appear. It seems to me that it is no longer a question of conscience but of feeling, and I am ready to try to meditate again. I was becoming pure experience when I realized that the process involves total trust. That's why people with problems can't live life to the fullest. They don't know how to reach pure experience. It is necessary to have confidence in knowing that everything is oneself. For a Westerner, understanding implies understanding relationships. For an Easterner, it implies feeling. Blessed is the union of understanding and feeling. Life becomes full of meaning. It's strange, but the plastic pen I'm writing with just melted in my hand. I don't want to say the whole thing, but the part where I rest my middle finger. It is necessary to know the world well before knowing a human being well. Night falls in the Sierra. The sun sets, and the clouds follow. On the other side of the firmament, dawn returns with the moon, but where the sun falls asleep, the sky is sheltered, protected by a thick blanket of clouds. At dusk, the clouds descend, guarding the earth. Now it's the stars' turn. Only a few black clouds rise above the lower sea, the earth's blanket. The evil of the day and the beginning of the night. And again the day. I tried meditating on a leafy slope by a stream and received love. And in the end, hardness. There are many mosquitoes here, I told myself. I walked to the place I knew first, the same one as yesterday. From here, clouds form below and the mountains are below. N7. The entire planet supports my consciousness and it travels. The clouds speak and watch over me so I don't make mistakes. Whenever I suffer, they comfort me, and the wind helps me overcome the suffocating fear, and the sun gives me light. Here I remember my sweet love with the sadness of not saying goodbye. Here I pray to God, and here I write. I asked for a seat on the mountain, and it was given to me. I gave my legs and received joy. I gave my shortcomings and was answered by being given responsibility for myself. The game. As everyone waited their turn, the good precise sound increased in frequency. At times it seemed as if that small pale white sphere continued to exist as a continuous line on the green meadow of the table. When they had first proposed starting the games, everyone had looked at each other in a stupor of empty hope. The only thing that could excite was new knowledge, and the prospect of hitting a sphere repeatedly and coldly excited no one. Only Crack sensed that some characteristics of space could be discovered this way. With a smile in his eyes, he nodded affirmatively. Damonto didn't keep him waiting, and 15 minutes later, The hollow sound was heard for the first time within the walls of the community. That night, Crack couldn't sleep. Dozens of images filled him, astonishing him with their clarity and detail. In the morning, he found himself wondering who he was and what he was doing on planet Earth. "I've wanted to be like a bird," he said to himself, frowning, "like a spirit free from ties, but I've only desired it. I suffered the temptations of accepting man, but I decided triumphantly and arrogantly," Crack smiled, "to remove myself from all contact with that materiality that always clouded my senses. Now I have more experience. I know that patience is required, and I've learned to understand it. Patience is the wisdom of recognizing levels. Patience is knowing what comes first and what comes last. I remember that in my desire to fly, I consulted with Don Lucrecio. I didn't call him, nor did I go see him, of course. I simply asked him a few questions. Don Lucrecio! At first, no one answered my call, but little by little, I felt a distinct tingling sensation followed by a buzzing in my ear. I knew someone was trying to answer me, and all that was needed was more force and intention in the call. Don Lucrecio! I finally heard the answer. I didn't like the tone very much, as it made me feel like I'd interrupted something important. Don Lucrecio, what the hell do you want? I want to fly. Then fly. Thank you, Don Lucrecio. That was the whole conversation, and from that day on I really tried. Here I faced the problem of how to achieve it. I consulted with some friends, and believing that a specialist would give me more information, I told one of them my problem. 2 weeks later they sent me here. I confess that in the first few days I found sympathetic ears. I told them about my dream, and they responded in a similar way to Don Lucrecio's. However, I soon realized I had been naive. No one in this place had a serious plan to fly. In this place, we're all crazy. Don Lucrecio! What? What am I doing on this planet? We brought you here. Who is it? The one. The one. That did alarm me. I don't understand what it means. Of course, what had to happen happened. The voice fell silent, and I found myself with the unknown and the usual question. Does it exist, or is it a carving of intention? I know no one will understand it the same way. No one has ever understood it. It seems to me that man only lives in moderate company. Of course, some may enjoy mediocrity and consider themselves equal to those who also usurp it. But not me. Not me. Not me. I was saying that I soon realized that this place was not a levitation institute, far from it, but what is commonly called a madhouse. I've suffered greatly in it, especially because of the complete lack of seriousness surrounding me. Only in my dreams and fantasies have I been able to figure out what I could do if I were free. First, I would raise funds, convince some millionaire of the need to fly. Then, I would gather people who are facing the same problem and, like me, want to solve it. Of course, I would also travel to lost tribes, ingest appropriate concoctions, and accept shamanic teachings. All of these things I would do if I were free. One day I asked Don Lucrecio again. Don Lucrecio, you again? Sorry for interrupting, but could you tell me when I'm going to be free? I must confess that before receiving the answer to this question, I sensed a hint of doubt in Don Lucrecio. It was the first time this had happened since I'd spoken to him, and it made me think his answer would be absolute. And so it was, he said. Now you are free. Accustomed as I am to following my friend's instructions, I settled down to enjoy my new freedom and decided to wait for signs. The first one didn't take long to arrive. They sent a Russian cosmonaut here who claimed to be an expert on Venusian life. I talked to him for hours on end, but I never dared to ask him a direct question. Perhaps my previous experiences blocked my understanding, or perhaps the timing wasn't right. The fact is that despite my indifference, I learned a lot about space. I understood that in that space lay the answers to my desire to soar through the air. I already know what the person reading this is thinking right now. They'll say, I'm just another madman. All I can say is that here, in this madhouse, I've learned to distinguish between a madman and a genius. It's not the activity or its content that distinguishes them, but simply the capacity for patience. The madman is impatient, and the genius is patient. Patient for what? To do whatever he wants. Anyway, I was saying that things started to change, and I started to feel like a genius. My cosmonaut friend and I recognized the need to learn about space, and it so happened that the day after that recognition, another sign arrived in our community. They sent a green table with white prints. They called it ping pong, but I recognized its manufacturer and knew it came from Don Lucrecio. Then, someone invited us to hit a little white ball. I accepted, convinced that I would learn the organization of space, and that this would be the patient way to learn to fly. I found Demonto absorbed in the sight of his own hands caressing each other. After a few minutes, we began to play. I saw the little white ball crossing the space between me and Demonto's, leaving a subtle, slightly smoky whitish line in that space. It had taken me years to perceive the traces of objects moving through space. It was fascinating to do so. And now, with Demonto, the traces of the ball began to form a semi-solid cloud of interconnections between my body and my friends. Above the green surface, a dense web of shimmering lines floated, and I directed the ball toward the gaps in that shapeless and spectacularly complex mass. That's what I love most about this game, building the tremendous web, and then filling its gaps with new lines. It's obvious that the ball's trajectory changes depending on the gaps it goes through. I know everything travels in space through those gaps, but no one notices. We played for 2 hours, and by the end, there was a whitish solid on the table, shining with violet reflections like a pasty mass that connected my arms to Demonto's. Getting rid of this mass was difficult. I gave up my place to another player and sat down to watch the little ball pierce through the white cloud, leaving gaps in it. Within a few minutes, there were so many, so intricate and interconnected, that I saw the entire structure collapse like a building eaten away at its foundations. I was amazed that no one noticed or at least reacted physically to the thunderous sound of the fall, but no one did. At night, in my cot, I thought that the secret of all movement and all things lies in the trace they leave in space. I knew that somewhere on the planet there must be people who knew the secrets of spatial traces. I imagined that by writing I fly in the air, they would be able to levitate, stimulated by the energetic content of their auric structure. I dreamed that I belonged to a tribe in East Africa that knew spatial writing. All the terms of this writing were onomatopoeic. If someone in the tribe wanted to love, they would write the concept in space. Intricate hieroglyphic lines altered the space around the name, so that just by looking at the written lines, one began to experience the emotion of love. Afterward, I spoke with Demonto. I told him I would begin an experiment with the game of ping pong, tracing the word I fly in space on the table, just as I had dreamed it. The next day I tried again without success. Without despair, I tried again for 2 months. Yesterday, during an evening game with Demonto, I managed to trace all the letters and felt a slight detachment. I ran to report it to the management of this institution, and today I realized the ping pong table had disappeared. Demonto accused me of being responsible for the robbery. I no longer care whether I was responsible or not. All I know is that it's possible to fly, and at night, when I visit my friends in Africa, I learn more than anyone here can imagine. Rabbi Simon ben Jochai smoothed his long hair and looked at his son Eleazar, leaning against the cave wall. He must have had the same dream again, he told himself, as he inhaled the damp, cold scent of dawn. Eli, he called softly, Eli again? The light of the moon is like the first letter of his name, the light of the moon. That's what Rabbi Akiba told us. Eli, Eli, did you hear me? The darkness of the cave is its own light, he thought, looking at his son. The darkness is based on light, otherwise it wouldn't be felt. Feeling, darkness and light are the same feeling, and feeling is like the light of the moon. I'd like to see you again, Rabbi Akiba, to tell you that you were right, that in isolation one understands and learns to see in the darkness, and in silence one finds God. The children played in the sun, dancing on the cobbled streets, and the adults pointed with their eyes at the two figures lost in thought, walking as if among clouds, looking up at the sky and suddenly tripping over a child and laughing. I miss you, Rabbi Akiba. I would like to tell you that you were right, and that time stops when pride is lost, that years last less than days and weeks longer than months, that suddenly you live without remembering the explanations, and so, suddenly there is light. And, Eli, did you dream it again? Eleazar wanted to fly. He had always wanted to, and in his last dreams he saw himself flying, supported by a strange drawing. A drawing he remembered when the tired dream of himself fluttered in the early morning. A drawing he forgot as soon as he tried to trace it in the sand that was scattered at the entrance of the cave. Eleazar had decided to accompany his father, who was being pursued by the invaders. They had taken refuge in that cave so long ago that the young man no longer remembered the moment they found it that morning. Simon ben Yochai was interested in his son's dream, not so much because he himself wanted to fly, but because he sensed that behind that drawing lay part of the wisdom of Rabbi Akiba, his beloved teacher. She remembered her last conversation with him shortly before his torture and death. They had talked about days and nights and other oscillations. Akiba, she remembered well, had used precisely that term, oscillations. The oscillations of day and night create patterns. The oscillations of the seasons create patterns. The oscillations of sound create patterns. The pattern that can contain all patterns, Rabbi Akiba had whispered in his ear, that pattern is the key to finding the secret name of God, and thus possessing all wisdom. What is the pattern that is created without any oscillation? Ben Yochai had decided to hide in the cave after seeing Akiba die at the hands of the Romans, and knowing he was being pursued by them to suffer the same fate. In the darkness of his dwelling, he heard the creeping sand of the desert and could no longer tell when it was day or night, winter or summer. What is the pattern that is created, unconstrained by any oscillation? Eleazar was a magnificent young man in his father's eyes, a dreamer, an idealist, but violent with words, to which he paid no worship. Words, he told his father and teacher, are not enough. Ben Yochai didn't agree. The word is also an oscillation, and surely, coupled with the drawing of your dreams, it will allow you to fly, he told him, smiling but serious. Eleazar agreed with a gesture, but secretly, he couldn't even glimpse a connection. The days passed slowly, the weeks swiftly, the months sluggishly, the years hurriedly. One day Eleazar cried out in the middle of the night, and Ben Yochai woke up, understanding. Did you see it? Do you remember it? It is a drawing that contains all the drawings in each of its parts. It is a drawing that repeats and reproduces and changes without changing. It is one drawing and there are many. It is... That memory was enough. The next morning, the two of them, father and son, went out onto the sand, lay down on it, and with one arm supporting a cheek and the other collecting small samples of that golden dust, they shook their heads. Too simple, even though each grain is like the rest, and contains them, and reproduces them, and is a pattern, and there are many of them, and it contains the whole, but too simple. Eleazar nodded, and looked at his father, understanding that his memory wasn't enough. There was something else. One afternoon, a vision of the mouth of a recently extinguished volcano submerged the rabbi's mind within its image, like someone savoring a delicious delicacy. The volcano appeared as if glimpsed from above, as if Ben Yochai's eyes had been torn from their sockets and launched into a terrifying ascent, floating among the clouds. But the clouds he saw were God's calligraphy. Behind the volcano appeared an enormous, reddish, splendidly fiery sun. Clouds colored a violet pink surrounded the volcano, and an intense blue sky was transparent here and there between the cottony, spongy vapors. Ben Yochai had never seen anything like it, and found himself trying to hold on to the image, and then learning to step into it, zoom out, zoom in, travel in circles, and later make others appear, until a whirlwind of visions accompanied him day and night. He only had to close his eyes, and there they were, and he, delighted, traveled among them. Soon he stopped understanding his son's desire, and considered every desire an attack on what happens when desire disappears. Why, he wondered, was there any action, if beyond any act lies the true meaning? He himself had no idea what was about to happen. One morning he found a point of light in total darkness. Since so much seeing had taught him to control what he saw, then to let it go, he decided to approach the point and later let himself flow within it. He did so, and as he entered the greenish-amber color of the tiny light, he recognized that it was only a small portion of a much larger image. He stepped back into himself, and just as he had sensed, the point of light became a companion to hundreds of other points, and he recognized in them the starry firmament of a clear night, and himself, capable of expanding his vision simply by distancing himself from a single detail. He continued to make more distance, and soon the entire firmament receded before his eyes, and a universe filled with spirals appeared complete and total, seen from a place that no longer belonged to the universe. He tried to retreat even further, and suddenly saw a Chinese mandarin floating in a space filled with crystals, sitting on what appeared to be a carpet of woven patterns. The face of the Oriental man was beautiful, and his slanted eyes focused on the drawings on the carpet indicated to him that this was the vision his son desired and expected. He approached the Chinese man and asked to see the carpet. He saw the same firmament as before, but two-dimensional and depicted in an adamantine weave made of microscopic silk threads of all colors. The Chinese man invited him aboard his ship and showed him how to travel. They didn't speak. All they had to do was look at the direction those slanted eyes focused on the woven firmament to travel to the same point in the real firmament. Little by little Ben Yochai understood the technique, and after applying it, he decided to return to his cave. Eliezer was tracing lines in the sand with a thin splinter when he recognized his father's footsteps and was amazed to see his figure wrapped in a golden halo. In a sudden flash of intuition, he sensed his father's condition and understood the golden halo as a manifestation of something sublime. Hundreds of thoughts coursed through Eliezer, among them the clear notion that beyond his quest, or the very act of flying, existed something limitless, but the foundation of life. In a few seconds, he realized that his usual way of seeing life had been shaken from its place, and that a new perception was enveloping him. He had felt something upon seeing his father that was neither his father, nor the golden halo that surrounded him, nor his almost floating walk on the sand, but rather what was essentially his father, and at the same time not his father. A self hidden inside an envelope, identical to the self hidden in any envelope, and at the same time in everything. A feeling of sameness without individuality, and simultaneously in an expansion of it, a sensation of being more than any restricted identity. Eleazar contemplated the line he had made in the sand and considered it superfluous. He saw himself eager to find, there too, the same thing he had seen in his father, and suddenly he realized it was identical. He got up from the sand and ran to embrace the figure approaching him. That night, with the golden halo still visible, the rabbi recounted his experiences, and his son recounted his own. Eleazar felt that something existed and was growing inside him, something so luminous and certain that when he closed his eyes and tried to fall asleep, he perceived a filigree of golden patterns immersed in a set of complex geometric shapes. He saw them so clearly that he repeatedly opened his eyes to check if his vision was external. Finally, he fell asleep and dreamed of a violet dot surrounded by a dark atmosphere. The dot grew larger, filling the dark area until everything around Eleazar was violet. Then, something conscious in the sleeping Eleazar decided to move away from that violet spot, and little by little, he watched, as his father had before him, as it diminished in size until it became a tiny rock-like object. Suddenly, everything around Eleazar took shape, and a magnificent landscape appeared before him. Within that landscape, and as an intimate detail of it, appeared what had previously been a violet hole. The process of moving away had built a world, and Eleazar, in his dreams, knew he had found the key to what he desired. "Father," he said to the rabbi the next morning, "one hole can become a tiny part of another hole, until, in an infinite spiral, the space around me becomes part of me, and thus a catapult for flight." "That's right," Simon ben Yochai replied calmly. "That's right, Father," Eleazar insisted again. "That is the drawing I was looking for, and now, strangely, I am no longer interested in the flight, but rather in the drawing and... do you understand?" "That's right," the rabbi repeated. Eleazar looked at his father's luminous face, and unable to contain himself, began to sob. From that moment on, a frenetic flurry of activity began. However, anyone who had visited the inhabitants of that cave lost in the desert, anyone who perceived nothing more than the external, would have seen only two calm, motionless, and thoughtful figures leaning against two walls of their room. Inside those two bodies, however, a flame blazed, and without the need for a word, one flame fanned the other until it reached the glow of a bonfire. Eleazar was less prepared to withstand so much light than Simon. Sometimes he felt like a real flame was burning inside him, and then he had no choice but to step outside into what at that moment seemed cool, and what a few months ago had felt like burning sand and sun. His father, on the other hand, seemed unaffected. He remained serene as the knowledge filtered through him with boundless joy. One afternoon the moon was whitish and semi-transparent. A deep blue afternoon, Rabbi Simon ben Yochai, leaning on a rock at the exit of his cave and playing with the friendly wind, decided to make an exception in his indecision and search for the root of his feelings. He tried to discover the observer within himself, and suddenly realized that what he experienced as observer was not the true himself, but another self. He tried to explain to Eleazar, but he found it impossible to describe the sensation of not finding a real self. "It's," he told her, "as if I contained all the people I've ever met and felt them as myself." Failing to explain, Simon delved once again into self-dissection to find his true self. One afternoon he believed he had made real contact and rejoiced in it, only to discover the next day that the sensation also came from another internalized self. Finally, in despair, he abandoned the search, and a few minutes later, he was suddenly overcome by a realization. He looked around and at his own body, and began to laugh so intensely that it caught Eleazar's attention. The latter watched his father laughing non-stop and asked him in amazement. "Everything is one! Everything is one!" Simon managed to say in the midst of his thunderous display of joy. That did not convince Eleazar, who, keenly interested in his father's sudden joy, tried to understand its most intimate meaning. "But then, who is the one who feels?" he asked her that night. Simon looked at him and smiled at the question. "I seem to remember," he said, "that language seems insufficient to you." "That's right," Eleazar replied. "Watch the flight of birds, feel the wind through the sand and observe its direction and strength. Walk the path of scorpions and glimpse the undulations, peaks and valleys of the distant mountains. Make your voice speak and your body move. Listen to the cry of the night and see the shadows cast by the moon. Make out the clouds and their contours. Compare the shadow of their interiors with the color of the sand. Now penetrate your feelings and see them as the clouds, the wind, the sand, the mountains and the moon, and you will understand that everything is one. Recognize the connection between the thoughts that illuminate you and the breath of your mouth. You will see that easily. Penetrate the union of thought with breath, and you will see that it is the same pace that binds thoughts. See your movements, and again recognize in their sequences the laws of your thought, the origin of light, and the oscillations of the wind. Discover it all for yourself." Eleazar dreamed of some strange bones, and the next morning, as the coolness of the night barely left the sand and the reddish glow of a rising sun painted everything the color of blood, he found the skeleton of a jaguar and the femur of a strange animal. The young man had set out on his usual walk, driven by the need for movement, and as a precaution against unexpected surprises, at the foot of a small hill, he had seen the bones reflecting the sunlight, just as the moon does, and with a similar message. Recalling his dream and comparing it to his sudden discovery, Eleazar felt the presence of a certain and powerful sign. He approached the bones, contemplated them for a few minutes, fascinated by the shapes, and then picked them up from their sandy bed. Once in his cave, he devoted himself to observing the details of the skeletons. He knew the skull was a jaguar's because upon touching it, he felt a swift feline fear. The other bone remained unidentified. The right half of the jaguar's skull was made up of gentle curves, careful slopes and delicate joints. The left half was rough, and instead of gentle curves, it was formed by sharp angles. Eleazar was fascinated by the difference. He recognized something of himself in it, two natures unified into a single being but distinct in themselves. One soft, the other hard, one curved, the other linear, one rough, the other spongy, one luminous, the other dark, one feminine, the other masculine. The other bone showed the same dichotomy. But if at one end the female portion was located on the right side, at the other, it shifted to the left, and did so again and again like a strange game of alternating bifurcations. In the jaguar, Eleazar recognized zones of fury and others of contemplation, sections of terrible, devastating intent, and others that were sweet and calm, of family frolic. The aggressive and intense areas were always surrounded by subtle growths, at the edges of which flames or what looked like fiery protrusions blurred. Eleazar sensed that these reflected power, and above all, an expression of power. On a further ledge, the rabbi's son saw a spiral-shaped slope, and another with two intertwined circles. He knew that the jaguar, as it advanced, left traces of its steps, and that this was a spiral intertwined with infinity. Any animal that came into contact with this footprint would retreat, overwhelmed by the clarity of certain death, of an unexpected infinite spiral. Every part of that skull began to speak to Eleazar's astonished senses, and left a taste of colossal wisdom in his memory. Each union of different bones to form a common structure moved him because of the presence of a unifying plan that transcended the existence of the concrete details of the skull. Something above and prior to its totality had decided to unite the bones in this way, and no other. A higher design had established a temporal order of survival in which the skull as a rigid structure would remain as a testimony to the functions performed by a more mutable and less permanent tissue. The unifying details of a history would be inscribed within the bone, that which was most repeated in it, and therefore that which most closely connected it, its reality, its constancy, and its habits. It was God's writing, and Eleazar thanked the One for the blessing of life. He who could draw his thoughts on a bone, he who made decisions, was innocent and beautiful, tranquil and pure and majestic, and a consummate artist. Eleazar strengthened his faith, and set about searching for new discoveries to study. For the first time in his life, something had spoken directly to the area of himself that, when activated, produces the sensation of witnessing. He had the clear impression that something without end existed, and that it had manifested itself to him as knowledge inscribed in one of the almost infinite manifestations of creation. How many manifestations were there? Eleazar spoke with his father and confessed that he had felt the endlessness. The Ein Sof presented itself to me, he said, trusting that Simon would understand. The Ein Sof exists. There is a place that is Ein Sof. His father looked at him delightedly. His eyes reflected a desire to share the hope of being able to talk. Simon knew that the Ein Sof Eleazar was referring to wasn't the real one, although nothing could have been closer. He listened to the jaguar's story and, with a smile, mentioned that the direction of the Ein Sof always pointed upward. The son of Ein Sof, he said at last, is horizontal. All the jaguars of the world, all the birds, all the fish, all of them are the sun. What they have in common, what indicates the presence of mind, what is thus felt, what draws us into a whirlwind, that is the Father. Eleazar felt disappointed, and with a feeling of sadness he left his father's presence. He reached the place where he had placed the jaguar skull and femur, and touching them gently, he allowed the images to envelop him. He saw a woman in the midst of battle. He saw her sustain the spirit, cleanse wounds, and preserve the light, heal, sanctify, and correct, and suddenly he saw her leap into the air with a cry of pain. He saw the woman's kidneys being torn to pieces by teeth and claws, and he understood the correspondence between body and function. Eleazar completely explored the jaguar in 2 weeks. He recognized that he and the jaguar were and were not the same. He remembered the teachings about oneness and said goodbye to his father. He headed to the sea to find the skulls of marine animals to test his sense of unity. He had to experience their separation and their union to understand their limits. Along the way, he studied cacti. At first, they seemed simple, but as he compared young with old, species with species, and families with families, he understood their complexity and beauty. Some showed geometrically perfect paths in the arrangement of spines and tiny projections. Others showed a tendency to abandon their own structure, launching new limbs and original forms into the heights. Eleazar realized that every manifestation of life attempts to transcend its own structure. He understood that such an attempt is, in advance, destined to fail, since the tool each living form uses is its own individual identity, and therefore participates in diversity. However, in diversity there is also unity, and therefore the possibility of transcendence. He remembered what his father had told him about the father and son of the Ein Sof, and understood its meaning. Whenever something similar happened, his love and respect for Simon grew, and on that occasion, he was almost driven back to the cave. However, he decided to continue on his way. and a few days later he heard a swaying clamor, felt a damp breeze, and saw the sea. He searched the shore and found the skull of a giant turtle. It was white and dried by the sun. Its interior was completely divided into two compartments, and on the outer part, a sort of gigantic flower was slightly blurred through subtle and delicate bone protrusions. Eleazar was stunned by the division and by the flower in its midst, and suddenly he sensed that the flower unified what had been divided and was the hope for reaching a transcendent world. The same thing happens again. We all want the same thing. When Eleazar returned to the cave, he found his father frantically writing. He was so absorbed in his writing that Eleazar didn't move. However, his curiosity and desire to share his new discoveries made him dare to ask. Simon was startled, realizing that in his concentration, he hadn't noticed his son's presence. They greeted each other, and Simon explained that he was beginning to write down his thoughts, guided by the Almighty. Meanwhile, Eleazar spoke of his skulls and his exploration within the unity. During Eleazar's absence, Simon's solitude had been so complete that now, listening to his son, he realized something very strange was happening to him. Suddenly, the sensation of continuity between one of Eleazar's movements and the next began to disappear. Then, the same thing happened with the words. One was a unity, and the next another, and both existed independently. Simon stopped understanding what Eleazar was saying and paid attention only to his new way of perceiving. In it, the reality of a perceptual continuum gave way to the experience of perceptual moments separated from one another, as if the glue that normally holds precepts together had disappeared. Astonished to the point of being impossible to resist, Simon interrupted his son's story by telling him that the glue of reality had been broken and that now everything was seen from before the creation of the experience. Eleazar stared at him in astonishment. My father, he suddenly thought, is no longer in this world, and I am alone. The paths of these two souls, voluntarily confined, began to diverge. Neither Simon understood what Eleazar was going through, nor did Eleazar understand his father's experiences. However, the divergence increased the respect and unity between the two beings. Simon worked to dilute the glue of reality, while Eleazar traveled within himself, trying to find a place that was truly his own. He compared his discoveries within himself with his memories of other people, and whenever he managed to abstract the intimate sensation of another's presence and compare it with his own sense of self, he found that both the sensation of others and his own dissolved into a strange, tormenting question. He didn't realize he was repeating his father's teachings. From where, he wondered, am I seeing what I see? What does it coincide with, and is it a source? What happened to Eleazar is what always happens during the transition from a concrete vision of reality to one in which the mystical and spiritual acquire meaning in themselves. At the interface, the spirit seeks support from the world and doubts itself as essence and source. Eleazar despaired at the lack of a connection between his thoughts and the concrete reality of his senses. He hesitated from one to the other, and still couldn't take the step that would lead him to accept spiritual truth as reality in itself and sufficient. One morning, she decided to consult her father. She doubted he would agree to delve into her question, so absorbed was he in his own thoughts. Nevertheless, she dared. What should I do to avoid comparing? Simon looked at him with interest and searched his memory, trying to find a stage similar to his son's to remember what had preceded it and where its consequences had led. Suddenly he remembered, and smiling he said to Eleazar, "Subject it to all doubts, try to destroy its appearance, and when you realize the impossibility of doing so, your mind will forget the questions, and only what lies beyond doubt will remain. That is to say, Eleazar stammered, that it exists by itself, and in its reality its existence does not require any support. That's right, the rabbi replied. That was enough to spark Eleazar's immense curiosity to know what his father was writing. He had no idea that the rabbi had decided to translate his analysis of the existence of different spiritual worlds onto parchment. The only thing Eleazar noticed was that his father was spending more and more time writing every day. One afternoon he asked her permission to speak, and feeling anxious about what she was going to ask him, he told her that he wanted to know what she was writing. Now, his father replied, I'm wondering about the different paths ideas take to appear in consciousness. I find that in every human being, the journeys are different, and at the same time the same. Simon pondered his son's request for a moment, and something in his mind ordered him to postpone granting his wishes. Finally he spoke. Let's wait a while, and when I see you strong enough, I'll allow you to read what I write. This intrigued Eleazar. His curiosity knew no bounds, and he wondered about his own strength, and how his father had such a clear vision of something about himself that he didn't even suspect. Surely when I have enough strength, I will realize and know what it means to have enough strength. That night, Eleazar went to bed with the question of the meaning of his strength swirling around in his mind. He dreamed that he was being chased and that terror made him disappear. Something, however, remained of him, since he was searching for himself, and the moment he accepted the terror, it disappeared, and he found himself again, becoming himself again, in a feeling of being unmistakable with his father's being and the being of all the friends he had ever had. He dreamed that this being suddenly ceased to be unmistakable and became identical to everyone else's, and in its very nature it seemed like a desert flower, and like it shone with the reflections of a simultaneous midday sun and a midnight moon. Eleazar woke up sweating and searched for the flower among the cave walls. Aware of the dreamlike nature of the image, he fell asleep again. He saw the flower again, but so close to his eyes that one of its petals seemed the size of an entire desert. He observed pulsating veins of sap and intricate patterns of octahedral cells caressing each other and changing shape according to the brightness of the sun and the whiteness of the moon. He heard a bird's song and, amazed, saw how the patterns of the desert petal altered according to the theme, amplitude, and rhythm of the song. He woke up again and saw his body lying on the cave floor. He brought the thumb of his right hand close to his eyes and saw the undulations of his fingerprints. He remembered the flower, saw his prints again, and suddenly understood. The next morning, he began building a loom. He remembered a weaver from Jerusalem and his loom, and he copied it. He needed a piece of very finely woven cloth to use as a membrane. He worked for 2 weeks and finally managed to mount the cloth on a frame that was none other than the base of a jaguar skull. He found fine sand and scattered a handful of it over the cloth. He placed his invention at the entrance to the cave and sat beside it, waiting for some stray bird to chirp, for some distant lightning to break the silence. When the latter happened, he approached the sand on the cloth and saw a perfect octahedral design. Tired of waiting for birds and thunder, he raised his own voice and returned to observing the sand. Each word left a clear mark. The cloth vibrated with the sound, and the microscopic grains of sand oscillated, shifted, and took up positions along the length and breadth of the improvised membrane, making patterns appear. Eleazar, fascinated, forgot about his father and began to howl in a real way, trying to change the tone of his voice. He observed that, As the sharpness increased, the resulting pattern became more complicated, but always retained a similar structure. Simon ben Jochai, initially alarmed by the shouts, watched his son's experiments with amusement and delight. He approached the jaguar skull and, seeing the patterns and their consistency, said something that left Eleazar petrified with emotion. "I see," he said, "that you are about to understand the meaning of your strength." Eleazar had sensed it, and all his effort in making the cloth, observing the sand and its patterns, had the unconscious purpose of answering the question. Now, the rabbi's words transformed that unconscious motivation into a sudden realization of the purpose of his behavior, of the reason for the fascination with the spectacle before his eyes, and of the reason, once hidden and now clear, for the almost uncontrollable physical arousal that had accompanied him throughout the entire experience. That excitement reminded him of his life in Jerusalem. His mind flashed back to his playmate and the excitement her mere presence produced. He tried not to think about his past, but now he knew that excitement was like the appearance of a pattern in the sand at the sound of thunder, except instead of sand, it was his own body, and replacing the thunder was the presence of the young woman who had so upset him. "Strength is what keeps me going despite all the changes," he said, delighted with himself. Excited, he approached Simon and timidly interrupted his writing duties. "I want to ask you," he said with a respect that amazed them both. "I want to know if what I have seen and understood is not illusory." Simon listened attentively, and upon hearing the consideration of strength as self-perpetuation, he smiled and stroked his son's hair. "Now," he said affectionately, "you must find out the true meaning of sameness. When you do, I will read you my writings. The true meaning of sameness? What I feel is a pattern to what stimulates me. The light changes and I see shadows, the sound changes and I hear music. However, the sound I hear is my sound, because in and of itself, it is only a movement of my fabric." Eleazar's young and brilliant mind wove filigrees of thoughts, attempting to answer the question. Eleazar knew that the only way to reach any correct conclusion was to let thought free, observing its events and changes from a place other than thought. "Sound," he continued, "I construct it as sound. I do the same with light and with everything that makes a pattern appear in itself. But then, what is it that I feel, and from where, and from whom, and how?" The solitude to which he had been subjected had accustomed Eleazar to a silence such that he could record his most subtle internal states. He recognized that he was on the verge of entering into an intense confusion, and remembered that on other occasions the same confusion had transcended itself when he managed to leave his mind and his thoughts behind, and enter a place alien to thought and close to the feeling of himself. "That's it!" he almost shouted. "My question about the origin of myself is less total than myself, and is therefore incapable of answering its origin. On the other hand, the leap from posing the question to experiencing my own self brought me closer to the answer." Eleazar decided to reach a point within himself he had never dared to before. He looked for the solitary tree he always went to for freshness and company, and headed in its direction. Its shadow strengthened his resolve. He approached the trunk of his companion, hugged it, and sat down, leaning his back against it. He closed his eyes and let his thoughts flow within him without resisting them. The sound of a cricket caught his attention. He heard it, and the image of its greenish wings and a paw caressing them appeared in his mind. The sound of an animal had brought the image to mind before, but it had never been as clear as it was this time. He remembered his question and tried to see his self and the cricket image as separated by a distance. He began to move away, and suddenly everything he heard and felt abruptly separated from himself. Eleazar felt as if he was seeing from a place where only silence existed, and that the contents of his experiences appeared elsewhere. He struggled to separate the two universes further, and suddenly felt an overwhelming dizziness. He felt himself inside a circle, floating near its circumference and spinning around it at ever-increasing speeds. He opened his eyes and screamed desperately. The spinning calmed, and Eleazar, still dizzy, lay down on his back to look at the leaves of the tree. What happened? He asked himself anxiously. Why did I introduce myself to that horror? He decided to go ask his father, and after a moment's hesitation, he decided to do so. He found the rabbi writing in his favorite place at the entrance to the cave. "Father," he called with such imploration that the rabbi was astonished and prepared to listen to his child. At the end of the story, Simon realized that he had abandoned Eleazar too much. "Eleazar," he said, "you are facing the test of oneness. There is neither complete separation nor complete union. There is something that transcends both, and you will find it when you truly find yourself." That reassured Eleazar, although, as always, it raised new questions for him, more than those words from his father could answer. Eleazar decided to go for a walk in the desert. After several hours, and now surrounded by the stars of a luminous night, he changed direction and headed toward his stone home. When Eleazar returned to the cave, his father was waiting for him. Eleazar was amazed to see him and greeted him warmly. Simon led his son into the cave and showed him the first page of his writing entitled The Zohar, the Shining One. The Book of Light, it read. Rabbi Simon ben Yochai smoothed his long hair and watched his son Eleazar leaning against the cave wall. He must have had the same dream again, he told himself, as he breathed in the damp, cold scent of dawn. "Eli," he called softly. "Eli again?"